Okay. So today we are going to talk about the spinal cord and its cross-sectional anatomy. And today what we'll be looking at actually is this structure here. And as you can see from all the labels, this is the spinal cord cross-section, and this is roughly at L1, right? And when you look at the spinal cord's like cross-section as well, I just want you to see this structure before we go ahead. And you can see that, you have gray matter in the center, right? You have this central canal. You have white matter here, all around in the periphery. Um, and you have the spinal nerve, which has this ventral or anterior part and this posterior part, right? And this gap that you see in the front of the spinal cord is called the anterior median fissure. Now, the reason why I'm telling you all of this stuff is because this is really important for all of you to know. The anterior median fissure is this big gap sort of thing in the front of the spinal cord, and the rear part around the back here. This is called the posterior sulcus. This small thing here. So once I remove the vertebra out of the way, you can see it. So if you look at this, you'll see that this is the posterior sulcus, right? And this is the anterior fissure in the front. And the only difference between a fissure and a sulcus is that fissures are usually much larger than, much more wider than a sulcus. They are essentially the same thing, which means a small depression along what it should be a smooth surface. So with that said, I'm just gonna, yeah. So with that said, I'm going to now just show you something else as well. So when you look at the spinal nerve, right, you have this anterior part, the ventral root, and you have the posterior root, and this here is called the dorsal root ganglion. So this ganglion is contains a lot of cell bodies, and whatever sensory input you get, sensory input you need or whatever, it all comes here, gets relayed, and then goes inside in the spinal nerve itself, right? And the thing is that this also acts in this way, that like the spinal nerve goes this way, and all of the stimulus that needs to go up to the central nervous system goes via this, and all the relay responses come out this way, or sometimes even down the back. It depends, right? But as a general rule, remember that the spinal nerve, this ventral root itself, this one is for motor function, and this is for sensory function, the dorsal root. So information goes in and goes out through this, and motor responses usually come from the ventral root. So, for example, if you think of moving your hands or whatever, the motor impulse from the brain is going to come around the ventral root and go in the front of the spinal nerve and come out through the spinal nerve. Whereas supposing you need pain or temperature or whatever, it's going to go inside the spinal cord through this, through the dorsal root, right? So that's just a basic idea that you need to know, right? And the thing is that this is a very simplified diagram. It doesn't contain all of the nuances like the blood supply and everything, but as a general rule, this is very helpful to sort of orient where we are at. Now, the next thing we're going to do is to talk about the spinal cord anatomy, and I'm going to just present this full screen. Let's see. You guys, can you still see my screen, or?
Yes.
Yes, we can see.
Yeah, like this is the full section screen. Like this is what I want you to see. Okay, hold on. Yeah. So at the first outset, right, like we are just going to take a look at what the overview of the spinal cord is, and then we'll go into like the nitty gritty of where the nuclei are, and what's in the gray matter, what's in the white matter. But when you look at the spinal cord, the first thing you need to understand is the blood supply. So, for example, if your essay question is write about the spinal cord's topography or write about the spinal cord itself, so first thing you should do is to try to you can start by writing about the segments as well and go up, but it depends either way. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to first go on the blood supply. So the spinal cord is actually supplied by the anterior spinal artery and two posterior spinal arteries and something called the artery of Adamkiewicz. Now, we are going to go into this a little bit more detail in the next slide, but in general, this is what I want you to know, that there are essentially four arteries that you need to know here. The two posterior spinal arteries, the one anterior spinal artery, and something called the artery of Adamkiewicz. And the artery of Adamkiewicz, is variable in people, but in general, it just supplies the lower 2/3 of the spinal cord. Now, the spinal cord, because it's a part of the central nervous system, also has meningeal covers. and from outside is the dura mater, arachnoid matter, and the pia mater. Now, the dura mater is very important because the dura mater essentially is the outermost covering. It provides most of the protection to the spinal cord as well as to the brain as well. So the dura mater originates from the foramen magnum and terminates at something called the filum terminale, which is somewhere here, like at around L1 to L3. It's L3 in children and L1 in adults. And it contains loose connective tissue and the internal vertebral venous plexus. So the blood supply, the blood drainage from the spinal cord comes from the venous plexus, which is inside the dura mater in something called the subdural space. Then you have the arachnoid mater. So the arachnoid mater is like important because it contains a subarachnoid space between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. And this space contains CSF, right? And then finally, you have the pia mater, which is like, it is almost continuous with the surface of the spinal cord, but it gives off these little outward projections called the denticulate ligaments, which help to hold the spinal cord in place within the spinal canal. Finally, we are going to talk about the enlargements as well. So there are two types of enlargements. There's the cervical enlargement and the lumbar enlargement. And cervical enlargement, in some textbooks, they say it's from C5 to T1. It's generally accepted that it could be either from C4 to T1 or C5 to T1. So let's go with C4 to T1 for now. And you can see it here that this is the cervical enlargement here, right? And then you have the lumbar enlargement. And the cervical enlargement, is where all of the brachial plexus nerves come out, right? And the same goes for the lumbar plexus as well, because it comes from the lumbar enlargement. And the reason why these two enlargements exist in the first place is because the areas that they are supplying require a lot of musculature. And because they have a high number of musculature with a lot of precise movements, because of this, you will need to have more nerves to go through that area. And that is why you have two enlargements, the cervical and the lumbar enlargement. Now, one discrepancy you can see is that in the text, in this, it says the lumbosacral. Here I say in lumbar, it's the same thing. Don't worry about it. It's essentially from the lumbar region it has to begin. And it can either involve some of the nerves. It sometimes involves all of the nerves from the sacrum, or they, sometimes they combine and then join up here. But the enlargement is the same. It doesn't matter if it's called lumbosacral or lumbar, it's the same thing. Now, finally, we look at the segments. And now this is an important part because there are only 7 cervical vertebrae, right? But there are 8 cervical nerves. So when we talk about like the brachial plexus or the lumbar plexus, whatever, we are talking about their roots, C6, C5, whatever. So we are not talking about the vertebra at which they're coming out. We're just talking about the spinal nerve. And it is very, very important that you remember that there are 8 cervical nerves and 7 cervical vertebrae. And the importance for this is that while most of these nerves, right, the spinal nerves, they exit from below the vertebrae. The C1 spinal nerve actually comes from above the vertebra. It comes over the atlas, sort of. So it goes above C1, and C2 and C3, so on and so forth. Everything goes from below their respective vertebral bodies. Okay. And here also coccygeal is just considered one segment because there's just too many of them. So, and the difference is that the sacral the sacral system, the 5 sacral ones, they come out directly through their own sacral foramina in the sacrum bone, right? So that is the basic thing that you need to know. And from here we will develop the concepts a little bit more in depth. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the blood supply. So the blood supply we can divide it into 3 sections essentially. So the first is the anterior spinal artery. So the anterior spinal artery, supplies the anterior 1/3 to 2/3 of the spinal cord. So roughly this area, right? The front part, so to speak. And it supplies in general the motor tracts, although maybe some of the descending tracts can also be some of the ascending tracts can also be supplied here. But as a rule, we just say that it's supplying only the motor tracts. It is narrower in the thoracic segment. And because it is narrower in the thoracic segment, what happens is that there are segmental arteries. These arteries that you see here overlying the spinal nerve themselves, they also will feed into this to sort of provide more blood supply or collateral blood supply. And It is found in the anterior median fissure in the middle here, this groove thing that you see. Now, the second is that there are two posterior spinal arteries. So the two posterior spinal arteries, they originate also directly from the vertebral artery, right? And some of them will originate from the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. And this is especially true in the upper segments of the spinal cord. So maybe C1 to C4 or maybe C1 to C7. And they anastomose in the pia mater. So they, sort of come around like this, and they anastomose nicely in the pia mater at the back to supply the posterior 1/3 to 2/3. So this entire posterior region is supplied by a huge combination of nerves, now of blood vessels. Now the problem here is that, look, I couldn't get a very high resolution picture so that you could see this carefully, but in your laptops and stuff, you'll be able to see it. And right now, when I go back to the 3D model, we'll see if we can appreciate it a little bit more deeply. But for now, I want you to just understand that segmental arteries, they are called segmental because you see this artery is called the posterior intercostal artery, like this, right? And then it divides into an anterior segment and a posterior segment. So the segmental arteries actually come like this, and they branch out and give off these multiple branches, that each of which is sort of supplying the rootlets that form this root here, right? So if you look at it like you would look at a tree, this is essentially the trunk of the tree. These are the roots. And so all of these roots are going to be supplied combined by some kind of radicular artery, which goes in the back. And then you have an anterior radiculate artery, and some of them by the segmental artery. So this posterior spinal artery actually, takes some of it from the vertebral artery, some of it from the posterior inferior cerebellar arteries, especially in the top. And they supply the posterior columns, these things, the dorsal gray matter, which is this part, and the dorsal sensory column, so which is essentially the lateral and the posterior part. Now we are going to go into much more depth with each level, but right now I just want you to think of this way, because a lot of times there are patients who will have spinal cord injury. So some of them, so supposing, for example, if I'm sitting in a car and driving, right, and something hits me from the back, now the likelihood that the posterior circulation is disrupted is much higher. And in this case, what happens is that whichever section is around the back that has lower amounts of perfusion because of ischemia or damage or bleeding or whatever, and it's just that the damage will be limited to the areas that the artery was responsible for, and the symptoms that the patient will develop are more or less concurrent with this. They follow this kind of pattern as well. And this is especially important because sometimes, for example, in the military, for example, there are lots of people who have shrapnel injuries to the back. So they are running from an explosion or whatever, and then they get hit by shrapnel in the back. And the shrapnel is really small. They are the size of like small nails or small ball bearings or whatever. And that can, embed itself in the spinal cord or embed itself in the back, but disrupt, one of these arteries, and you'll have some amount of sensory deficit, right, if you don't have complete transaction. Second is something called the Brown-Séquard syndrome. So the Brown-Séquard syndrome is called the hemisection of the spinal cord. In this case, what happens is that the left or right side gets completely occluded, likely because of a bilateral injury. So there is some injury to the anterior part, some injury to the posterior part, but it's like on the left side or entirely on the right side. And because of this, the damage is entirely located to one side. And you'll have a pattern of illness or a pattern of sensory and motor deficit that is concurrent with the damage. And that will become more clear once we discuss the individual components of the gray and white matters. Finally, look at this one. The anterior and posterior segmental medullary arteries, which are like, these ones here, like the anterior segmental artery, these come together to form something called the artery of Adamkiewicz. So if you look at this picture here, this is the artery of Adamkiewicz. Now, this is a very special artery because in the lower half of the spinal cord, like somewhere in the T8 to L2 levels, in that area, you have two supplies going through. You have the anterior spinal artery as well as the artery of Adamkiewicz, and they come together. So if you look at this image here, you'll see that the artery of Adamkiewicz is coming close and just joining with the anterior spinal artery. And this is entirely because it has some supply from the inferior intercostal arteries. It has some supply from the upper lumbar arteries, anywhere between, say, T5 to T8-ish, something like that. And it's on the left side of the aorta. And in 75% of the population, it lies between T8 to L2. That means its length is somewhere from T8 to L2. And it terminates entirely at the anterior spinal artery. So it in itself gives us some small branches here and there to supply the anterior part and the anterior section of the spinal cord, right? But it will also give us some of the smaller collateral branches, and it ends at the anterior spinal artery at T12 at T8, right? Now it supplies 2/3 of the spinal cord, the lower two-thirds. Like, so for example, the lower thoracic, lumbar, and sacral regions. And see, mentioning the sacral region is a bit complex here because, the spinal cord terminates at L1, and then after that you have the cauda equina, which is where the sacral nerves come from. But because they are originating so high within this region, L1, L2, they are going to be supplied and perfused by branches coming from the artery of Adam-Kimmich. And if the artery of Adam-Kimmich is damaged during operation, or it has some kind of thrombosis, then you will have a pattern of something that looks a lot like cauda equina syndrome, but it's not entirely cauda equina syndrome, which is when all of the cauda equina nerves, the lower nerves, they have lower amounts of perfusion and they don't work as we expect them to, and there is something called a sensory and motor deficit. So up until this point, we have covered the basic idea of what the spinal cord is, right? From where it begins, where it ends. And remember that in adults, the spinal cord itself, the filum terminalis, which is the last-ish part of the spinal cord, that is at L1. And in children, it's at L3. And this is important because you're going to be doing something called a lumbar tap. So lumbar taps are when we want to just take a sample of the CSF. And this is important in patients. In most patients, you do it at L2, L3, something like that, right? Because we know that at L1, the spinal cord ends. And you go after that after that, you will be able to collect the the CSF without damaging a major part of the lumbar system. And in children, it's a little bit lower because children are kind of small. And as they grow bigger, the spinal cord doesn't grow at the same rate as the rest of the body. So we have done this much. Now let's go on to the main parts, the internal anatomy. So when you look at the spinal cord, this is the general idea of the internal anatomy. Now, I'm not sure if you guys can read this because the text is probably too small, but don't worry. I have divided it all into 3 parts. So into 2 parts, so we'll be studying the gray matter separately and the white matter separately. But in general, remember, you have the gray matter here and you have the white matter here, right? So the gray matter is responsible for anything that does not contain myelin at all. So all the nuclei, all of the nuclei, all the dendrites, the cell bodies, whatever, and unmyelinated axons, they belong in the gray matter, right? So if you look at the gray matter section, you'll see here, the first thing I put here is that it contains unmyelinated structures like the cell bodies, dendrites, and unmyelinated axon. Now, the second thing I want all of you to, the second thing I want all of you to also remember is that the gray matter is inside only in the spinal cord. In the brain, the gray matter is outside, and the white matter is inside. So this is called a reversal essentially. So when you look at the divisions as well, you'll see that there's an anterior part of the gray matter and a posterior part, and a small bit here called the lateral part. And one trait that you will understand is that as you go from the cervical to the spinal cords, the gray matter content increases, right? Whereas white matter will decrease as it goes from the cervical section to the sacral section. Now, second, the white matter. So the white matter also contains all the myelinated axons, and these myelinated axons are the structures that are responsible for giving the color of the white matter. And this also has the same divisions. You have this anterior aspect, you have this lateral bit, like this lateral bit here. Like this is the anterior part, this is the lateral part, and then you have the posterior part, right? And the one thing you need to know about the white matter is that, we call them white matter columns, but they can also be called funiculi. So oftentimes in your multiple choice question papers, you will have a question like, please write down the contents of the lateral funiculi of the spinal cord. So remember that the funiculi and columns mean the same thing. They're not different. And the difference here is that when you look at the divisions as to what they contain as well, you'll see that you'll notice something, that it's aside from the DCML, which is this posterior column of the white matter, everything else, all other columns contain a mix of both ascending and descending tracts, right? So in this part, for example, let's go to the anterior part or the anterior column of the white matter, which is this one. Here you can see that although these are mostly descending tracts, there's also one ascending tract, right? The anterior spinothalamic tract. The same thing happens with the lateral column as well. You have a mix of both ascending and descending tracts. But when you go to the DCML pathway, or like you go to the dorsal column, like the most like posterior one, this one, there is only a sensory tract. That's it. So if nothing else, I want you to just be able to remember and say these three things. What contains the gray matter? What are the divisions of the gray matter? Like, so anterior, posterior, lateral, those are the same. And whether they increase or decrease from cervical to coccygeal, right? Now, there is something called the central zone. Now, central zone is not important at your level for now, right? But that doesn't mean that we don't talk about it a little. So the central zone is this area just around the central spinal canal, and it contains something called the gelatinous substance of the central zone. This is not the substantia gelatinosa. Substantia gelatinosa is in the posterior column of the gray matter. This is just called the gelatinous substance of the central zone. Now, this is important because a lot of times you'll have crossovers coming from, there'll be decussation of the second order neurons, the first order neurons, whatever. And this thing helps to sort of facilitate that move. It allows the tracks to go more smoothly so that the impulses can travel faster across this decussation point. Now, finally, I just want to talk about the pathway of spinal nerves. And here, this is the text part I've written for you. This you can read later. What I'm going to do is to actually just explain to you what spinal cords look like. And I'll tell you why the spinal nerves are important. So if you look at this structure here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this, whatever, the sixth cervical and the fifth one, right? I hope you guys are still able to see the screen.
Yes, we are.
Okay, great. So now if you identify this area here, you'll see that this is the spinal cord, right? And we are looking at the spinal cord from the back. So this is the posterior surface of the spinal cord, okay? And you see this whole tangle of nerves. Essentially, these are the components of the brachial plexus, and the way spinal cords work is that, they are going to give you one anterior ramus, one posterior ramus, and they come together to form the spinal artery, or like spinal nerve, the C6 spinal nerve, for example. And this spinal nerve is what continues on to form the trunks. It forms, so for example, this is the anterior ramus of the right spinal nerve, right? And this is the posterior one, right? And this is going to divide further. But this anterior ramus is what gives the feeding into the brachial plexus. So when you look at all these nerves of the brachial plexus, and you're studying the brachial plexus, you need to understand that they come from the spinal cord directly, and you just have to go back to be able to connect them. And you can see here that it's not as if all of the, it's not as if only the anterior parts are being connected. So you can see that anterior parts can come together to form, one like trunk, but sometimes they can have a posterior one as well, depending on what the ultimate function of the nerve is. And this is an area that a lot of you guys are getting confused at, because I'm looking at the chat and stuff, which is fine. It's neuroanatomy, it's very confusing. But remember, nerves and impulses go two ways. You understand me? So you have sensory perception, which is going up, and you have a motor response, which is coming down, right? And so for all of these motor nerves, like the brachial nerve itself, like all these nerves in the brachial plexus, they are all taking some amount of sensory information, right? Because you have the skin, so that is going to give you some information, right? Touch, pressure, pain, temperature, whatever. And they're also going to have motor output tracks. So that means, suppose I want to grab something, I want to wave my fingers like this. I'm being recorded, but I want to show my middle finger to somebody, which I like to do all the time. That all of these actions are motor functions, but they also require sensory input. So remember that these are not just whenever you look at the brachial plexus nerves, they're not just functioning only in one way. They're also responsible for a little bit of motor, they're responsible for sensory input as well. Now, I will give you a caveat in that, right? So, for example, let's take the ulnar nerve. The ulnar nerve is responsible for all the innervation in the lateral aspect of your arm, of your forearm or the hand. There's these two areas, right? So you're doing motor function this way, but you also have skin, and you need to know, like, you need to be able to perceive the skin as well, right? So the point here that I want you to all understand is that when you're trying to connect the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system together, right? You need to know just this tract and how the spinal cord itself comes, right? And you have this posterior rootlets, right? And then they go into this dorsal root ganglion, and they come around the front to form the spinal nerve, and then the spinal nerve again divides into an anterior ramus that goes into the bigger plexuses or whatever, and the posterior ramus which goes down the back. It's to give you some amount of sensory information like pain or like some other muscles in the back, whatever, right? And I have written this for you in text and here, so you can understand the full in the presentation, so you can understand the full tract of how this forms. And this is very, very important for you because this will make understanding the brachial plexus easier. Okay, so now we're going to go back to the text, and let's see. Yeah. So here we have the spinal cord's gray matter, right? So we've seen that how the spinal cords go in and go out, right? So when that same image from the back, I just want you to remember is like all the rootlets are coming in this way, carrying sensory information, right? And all of the motor parts are coming out from the front. So remember, the anterior rootlets, the anterior section is mostly responsible for motor output, and the lateral and the posterior parts are mostly responsible for sensory input, right? So when you look at the gray matter in itself as well, this will become a lot more easier. So we've spent the last 2 weeks studying the ascending and descending tracts of the spinal cord, right? And whenever I said that, yeah, they're going to enter the spinal cord at this level and do this or do that, the point is that when they enter the spinal cord, they're going to go through these nuclei, depending on where or which level the nerves are coming from. So if they're from the upper body, they'll go to the nucleus proprius. If they're going from the lower body, they'll probably go through the marginal nucleus, right? Or from the posterior thoracic nucleus if the information is coming from the thorax, right? So we are just going to look at the gray matter again under the same division. So it contains unmyelinated structure, great. Then it has the nuclei, basically are the cell bodies of all of these different tracts, and they are laid across on the gray matter in a specific way. And it has these three sections. It has this anterior section here, right? It has something called the medial section or the lateral section, like they're basically the same thing. We call them intermedius as well, right? And then you have a posterior section up here in the back. And the other thing is that there is something called the classification of Rexhead. So Rexhead's classification is when you have multiple laminae. So you have laminae that are marked from 1 to 10, and 1 is from the posterior, 2 is again going down the posterior horn essentially. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then 8 and 9 are entirely anterior, right? And then you have 10, which is around the central zone. Now, the way Rexhead decided to make this classification was based on the cellular cytoarchitecture, and that is a very complex topic, which I'm not qualified to teach you about it. But in general, you need to know this simply because there are certain types of neurological conditions where only a certain lamina is going to be affected, like some kind of some rare chorias, for example, some rare illnesses. Some rare autoimmune conditions will cause damage only in the fifth and sixth lamina, but they leave the rest of them okay. So the type of neurological symptomatic pattern will be different. So now, with that said, let's go on to the actual part. So the anterior part, this part, like contains the motor neurons in the Rexhead 8 and 9, right? These motor neurons, like, these are responsible essentially for a lot of the motor tracts that are coming out. So remember that this is an outward tract. This is where the lower motor neuron components begin for the motor tracts. Now, if you remember from my previous, talk, you have this thing called the upper motor neuron and the lower motor, right? So the upper motor neuron is anything that is coming from the brain all the way down to the spinal cord, and they will end here somewhere, depending on where they are supposed to go, which muscle they're responsible for, whatever, right? So these are this is the ending point of the upper motor neuron. And this is also the beginning of the lower motor neuron, because the lower motor neuron will begin here, come out and end or terminate at some muscle group, wherever it needs to, right? Now, when you look at the posterior section, right, you will see that it contains sensory neurons. And those sensory neurons are like the marginal nucleus, this one. You have the substantia gelatinosa, right, this gray part, right? Then you have the nucleus proprius and the posterior thoracic nucleus. Now, the substantia gelatinosa, this one, this gray bit here, this is completely responsible for both pain and temperature. So when pain and temperature information is coming inside, it's going this way, and it crosses over, goes up, right? So the point is that it has to come here into this place. And from here, it has to go up and, terminate somewhere else, wherever it needs to be, right? So the point is that, like, sometimes the substantia gelatinosa can be affected in a lot of different conditions, like rheumatoid conditions, spinal cord conditions, trauma, cancer, and the person loses the ability for uh, contralateral sensation of pain and temperature together. And I'm telling you why pain and temperature are brought together is because when we look at the the white matter, we'll be able to understand this better. But when information is coming inside and splitting up, it's going to connect to some other nuclei as well and go somewhere else up, right? And remember, the lateral spinothalamic tract is responsible for pain, whereas the anterior one is for temperature and crude touch. And why is that important? Because supposing if I light up a lighter, put my hand on it, right? I need to know that, yeah, there is pain, so this is damaging, but I need to know where the pain is coming from as well. So the anterior spinothalamic tract helps you to localize it. And the way it does it is because both of these places, they originate at the same place. They come in from the same place and then they split up. One side goes to the anterior, one side goes to the lateral, right? Now, same thing when you go to the lateral aspect, which is this part, right? And here you have something called, like, this is the tough part here, the lateral bit. Because across the spinal section, the thickness of the lateral part of the gray matter differs. So, for example, we have this thing here called the nucleus dorsalis. So the nucleus dorsalis is for posterior proprioception. So, it's for knowing the position of my body in space, and a lot of times it gives direct information to the spinocerebellar tract, so that my body's posture can be moved or corrected without me having to consciously think about it. And this is only present between C8 to L4. So between C1 to C7, it's not there. And then at C8, it begins, and at L4, it ends. Then you have the interomediolateral nucleus, this one right here, right? This contains something called the flight of flight segments, right? It's another way of saying that it contains both sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers to control the parasympathetic ganglia, and it helps to regulate autonomic function like rest and digest, right? Then you have the sacral parasympathetic nucleus, which is only present between S2 to S4, and it's not in this image. Then you have the interomedial nucleus, which is only present between T1 to L3. And these are all visceral afferent nuclei, which means that they are carrying information from all the lower body, like T1 to L3, and taking it up to the brain, right? They act as a relay point. They act as the nuclei. So this is where the incoming neuron sort of synapses, right? So finally, we take one last look at the Rexed laminae. Rexed laminae, I have written here which Rexed laminae they belong to. This is important for you, and I want you to revise this as much as is possible, because a question could come to you like, okay, in Rexed lamina number 3, which nucleus is present? So if you look at this chart in nucleus in Rexed number 3 is the nucleus proprius, whose function is fine touch and proprioception. So I've tried to make this as simple as possible for all of you guys, right? And I hope that it helps. But do try to study this part as well. You need to know which nuclei exist in which Rexed lamina. Okay. So now we're going to go to the next section, which is the spinal cord's white matter. Excuse me. So the white matter contains all the myelinated axons, right? And it also has the same divisions, the posterior column, the ventral column, lateral column. And here we can take a look at this brilliant image. You can see that the dorsal column only has the DCML pathway. And when you try to expand the DCML pathway, it's literally called dorsal column medial lemniscus path. That means that this dorsal column just means this, that this area of the white matter. Now, when you look at the ventral column, which is also called the anterior column, here you have one ascending tract, which is the anterior spinal thalamic tract, and the rest of them are all descending tracts, right? Now, I am going to say this, and this is going to be something that you need to really, really understand. I told you before that the anterior spinal thalamic tract is responsible for crude touch, right? It's responsible for crude touch is because so that, supposing I want to know the surface that I'm actually holding up my bottle, right? I can do that because I have crude touch receptors coming from the ascending tract, especially the anterior spinal thalamic tract. Now, if you look at these descending tracts, these are all motor tracts. The anterior corticospinal tract, which is one of the most major voluntary muscular control tracts. And look at this, the tectospinal tract. The tectospinal tract is responsible for tracking eye movements, like tracking an object and moving the head and the neck to follow just like some kind of visual stimuli. Vestibulospinal tract. The vestibulospinal tract allows you to maintain balance and take information from the ear for both conscious and unconscious control, but mostly unconscious control. Then it has the medial the medial reticulospinal tract, which allows you to increase muscular tone. Now, why are these things all together? When I have pain, for example, I burn my hand, whatever, I need to immediately retract my hand. All of these muscles and the nuclei you see here are interconnected so that you have a very fast response. And this is an evolutionary trait. The reason why these are grouped together is because of that. That while you may know that the pain is coming from up there, from the lateral spinal thalamic tract, right? But the fact that you've touched something and it is combined with pain and you need to quickly move your hand away is done entirely because of the nuclei present, which are all motor tracts. They all supply motor tracts here in the white matter. So that is the important integration part, right? Now, when you look at the lateral column, you have the same exact thing. The ascending tracts is the spinocerebellar tract, the lateral spinal thalamic tract, the descending tracts, the lateral corticospinal, rubrospinal, olivospinal, reticulospinal. All of these are bunched up together because they sort of give the same, they are sort of grouped together because they have similar-ish functions, right? And when you look at this as well, you will remember in the white matter, you don't have rexed laminae. Rexed laminae are only present in the gray matter. In the white matter, we just call them anterior section, posterior section, lateral section. And even in this lateral section as well, the thickness or like how big the groups of cells are, the groups of neurons or nuclei, this is going to be different at different levels, right? At each different level, you will have this, have a slight difference. Now, there are a couple of other matters that I didn't have the time to put in my presentation, right? So I'm going to just cut this out for the time being, and I'm going to give you something else. I'm going to just stop sharing for a sec. And if you have any questions, just write them down. I'm just about to stop the recording, but just give me a minute. Take the next 2 minutes to write down any questions that you might have if something is not clear to you. And just give me a minute. I'm just going to search up something here. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen one more time, and you guys can see this. I want to actually open up this image here. And in this image, you can see the sort of transition as you move down the spinal cord, right? So in the cervical section, take a look at how big the anterior gray matter part is, right? And then in the thoracic section, it becomes smaller. Then again, it becomes big in the lumbar section. And then in the sacral region, it is huge, right? Now, I want all of you to take another observation, which is this is the white matter. And because this is an MRI, you're going to look at it opposite, but this is the gray matter, this is the white matter. In the white matter, take a look at what's happening. The total volume of the white matter is reducing, right? So as you go from top to bottom, there is a greater need for motor neurons, which is why at the very sacrum, where you have a lot of connections coming from the legs, you have a bigger and much more wider anterior column because there are more motor nuclei present here. Because a lot of the musculature, like your legs and your toes and or the quadriceps muscles or whatever, all of them need to give back information, and it needs to go up from here. And also because in the lumbar and the sacral region, you have also some very important motor control sphincters: the rectal sphincter, the anal sphincter, and the urethral sphincter, right? So this is the reason why you have this kind of change. If, for example, I remove the labels, if you took one look at it, you will now be able to understand the cross section as well. And this is important for you not just now, but eventually when you are actually going to become doctors, which is in a few years' time only, you will be asked to take a look at MRIs or cross sectional images like this and be asked to localize where it is at. Okay, so with that said, we have come to an end for now. And give me 1 second. I'm going to just stop the screen sharing here.